Buddy Sotello, Esquire, and Evan Ginzburg. Would you like to introduce our guest this week, Evan Ginzburg?
Absolutely. He's my buddy from Kings of the Ring, wrestling radio drama. This is not, reviewing Raw and SmackDown and AEW. This is art. And he is Steve TeTai. How are you, Steve?
Very good. Thanks a lot, Evan. Thanks, buddy. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, thanks for being on here. So I'd like to know a little bit about your origins in wrestling. What got you started in professional wrestling?
Okay. Well, I've always wanted to be a booker as long as I could remember as a fan, even before I technically knew it was a work or before I even knew that a booker existed or that it was called booking. I had no idea. I just knew that as a kid, I'd watch wrestling and I would see stuff. It was like, wow, that's really cool, but wouldn't it be neat if this happened, too, or that'd be kind of neat to do this. So it was just always something in my head that I always wanted to pursue. And so keep in mind, this is like in the early 80s. So this is well before the internet and before I'd even discovered, well, I don't think newsletters were around too prevalently in the early 80s. So I had, I wasn't smart enough at all and had next to zero inside knowledge. I grew up in Wisconsin, where there's not a huge local wrestling scene historically. So it's not like there was like a local wrestling company I could be hanging around all the time and, eventually meet someone, that sort of thing. So it's just sort of something that I sort of took along with me as I got older. And then as I became an adult, I decided to go for it all the way. I managed to contact with Jim Ross at some point in the early 90s. And he sort of laid it out in the sense of, well, I understand your situation, but you can't just sort of walk in, just like how someone can't just walk onto an NFL team and be the head coach. You can't do that in wrestling either. You do have to work your way up, which I understood. And so it's all about finding a path to that. So I originally traveled down to Tennessee, trying to get in with Jim Cornette and the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Group out of Knoxville. And this was like 1995. And so when we met, what he ended up telling me is he didn't want to move me all the way down to Tennessee because he couldn't afford to pay me anything. And as it turns out, he wasn't just whistling Dixie. He ended up shutting down the company about a few months after that. So I did manage to find an independent group in Wisconsin, the one lonely group that I found. And I was able to get in, be sort of a promoter's assistant, setting up the rings, just sort of learning the business that way. But because of the state of wrestling in those days, an independent company in Wisconsin, we're talking like one show every 4 to 6 months. So
what federation was that? What federation was that?
It was called, let me think here. It was called New Age Championship Wrestling.
Where was that based out of? Where was that based?
It was out of Northeast Wisconsin. I do know there was a Milwaukee one, DeSantis or something. I know they had something going. I think Mid-American was their name, but it was a bit too far from where I was. So I got on this, occasionally running group, and it just wasn't working. So I decided to move to the Northeast, to Philadelphia, because at least at that time, Evan, you'll remember in the mid to late 90s, that was like the closest thing to a hotbed. For that level of wrestling between out of the few, I don't know, there's maybe like 20 groups in the country at the time. It seemed like at least 5 to 7 of them were all, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, that area.
Well, Joe Goodhart's group was bringing in world-class talent, and then when he folded, ECW was on the rise, and Philly was a hotbed for sure in the 90s. Yeah.
That was the place. So I figured I'd have a shot to get in with someone there. And so I ended up connecting pretty quickly with Afa, the Wild Samoan. He was out of Allentown. So when we met, we sort of had that instant connection because we're both Polynesian. Afa, of course, Samoan. And then I was born in the U.S., but my family is Maori, out of New Zealand, the Polynesian indigenous people of New Zealand. Hawaiians, Tongans, Samoans, the Maori in New Zealand, we're all sort of the same people. We're individually different, but we're always connected by that South Pacific people. So we'll always be connected. We'll try to help each other out It's just like if there were like 50 wrestlers who were all from like Cincinnati or something. They'd all be sort of helping each other out throughout their careers, and so that's sort of how we do it. And then that still goes to this day. As more younger wrestlers come up, like a Jeff Cobb or whatever. I'll meet them, and there's a bunch of other people throughout the business, and so it's sort of this loose network that we can sort of be connected that way. So right off the bat, I was already in pretty tight with Afa and the family there, and so that was out of Allentown. And so I'll go ahead.
Before we talk about your actual show, as far as booking, what I've always found being involved in various capacities with different indies, it was always about nepotism, cronyism, the promoter's girlfriend, the promoter's nephew, the promoter's niece, the promoter going through the table, etc., so on.
Right.
Can you think any time in history where a tremendously booked territory or promotion succeeded because they avoided those pitfalls?
Right. Yeah. You know what? The only thing I can think of is that those times where the family members were actually good, I guess, like the McMahons, where Vince Jr. ended up being pretty good. The Jerry Jarrett had Jeff, although he didn't really pass it on as a promoter. But yeah, you're right, though. It usually doesn't end up well. You've always got like the Bill Watts, Eric Watts deal in WCW, and Nick Goulas and his son. You guys have heard those stories?
Yeah,
out of Tennessee, where it was like, I always hear those stories how it was the worst case of nepotism of all time, where apparently this kid,
Greg Gagne and Vern Gagne,
right? Yeah,
Greg was solid. Greg has a bad reputation. He was a great.
I always found him to be one of the most boring wrestlers that I've ever watched.
Greg was a solid tag team wrestler. He got a bad reputation.
It looks like Jim Belushi in the ring. That's one we'll have a difference of opinions on.
I did always remember Greg Gagne because he was one of the first like undersized guys I can remember. And for a time in the early 80s when I started watching, and there's like the Road Warriors and, Crusher Jerry Blackwell walking around there, and Greg Gagne at like, I don't know, 218, maybe 210. It definitely stuck out.
Good drop kick.
Difference. Yep, excellent drop kick.
But you also knew if he didn't have his daddy's push, he would never be anywhere. He'd be selling insurance. He looked like a guy that would be more like he'd be selling insurance than actually getting in the ring. So
right, yeah, you wouldn't look at him and think, yeah, this guy's destined for headlining arenas. That's for sure. Yeah. But with booking, it is interesting with the nepotism and just the favoritism in general. I can tell you, after I was with Afa for a bit, he trained me to wrestle. He didn't want me anywhere around the ring unless I was trained, and also because he knew, sort of grooming me booking wise, that it would sort of help with me dealing with the wrestlers if they know that I've taken the same bumps they did and know what I'm doing in the ring, that sort of thing. But I remember, so by age 23, I was named Booker. So I got that pretty young, so that was a good deal for me. I was pretty happy about that. But there was always those Booker situations where I would purposely not book my guys in too high of a spot, just because I didn't want anyone to think that I was playing favorites or be accused of all that. And so it sort of sucked for the wrestler. I'm sorry, I was a manager too. That was the thing. So I was on the show as a manager. I had like a whole mask gimmick with face paint and all that called the Prophet. But the wrestlers that I managed, because I was booking too, I would purposely make sure no one ever held a belt. So they would be in the mix, but I would never let them win the big match, very specifically because of that. So they sort of suffered for it. And they would grumble a little bit. But they did understand, because I completely understand that dynamic of favoritism and nepotism and all that. And I didn't want to be one of those guys.
So who do you consider some of the great bookers in wrestling history?
Well, there's so many. I'm a big Paul Heyman guy.
Oh, yeah.
I consider him sort of like the Quentin Tarantino of wrestling in that sense. The things that he really pushed in ECW. And his sort of style of instead of booking your show where you've got like roles you have to fill and then finding the wrestler that'll do it. Like, okay, my top guy needs to be this, so let me who will fit. I liked how he took the roster for what it was and figured out the best way to use that individual talent. And I prefer that approach into wrestling. So it's one of the best things I love about Paul Heyman as a booker. Jerry Jarrett in Memphis, of course. I mean, so much legendary wrestling happened down there, because of the booking. And Dusty Rhodes. I don't know if I'd rank anyone, but I feel like Dusty Rhodes gets a little too much flack because there was a time period where there was a little bit too much screw jobs going on, and he'd get accused of putting himself over too much or keeping himself up at the top. But for pure booking, that run from 1984 to 85, up until 89 when Dusty left, I mean, it's just fantastic. And I think the biggest piece of evidence, if anyone doubts, Dusty Rhodes' booking prowess, is the reality that in the peak of the Cold War, that he took a Russian and turned him the biggest babyface in the Deep South, 3 years before the Cold War ended, in the Deep South of all place, and he actually made a Russian babyface, and that was pure booking. Taking the real life circumstance of what happened with Magnum TA and just all the storylines that built up to that point. And to be able to twist that and to make him 100% babyface, I just think is unbelievable.
I'm attending wrestling since 1974, 46 years. And I tell people, and I sincerely mean it, that promotion, I would see them in Philly and Jersey and occasionally Baltimore. Crockett back in the 80s, that was the greatest wrestling I ever saw. I mean,
that's awesome.
And Dusty, just Dusty and Tully, I mean, had classic matches all the time. Yep. And he got a bad rap from the hardcore fans because Dusty was great. Dusty was great.
Yeah, because I hear that's sort of like where most of the heel fans were starting to show up, right? Because I'd always hear that when you hear the NWA guys talking about the 80s. I remember, you going up to Philly, going up to Baltimore and all that, New York area. That's when the heel fans would be coming out.
Oh, yeah. Because the Horsemen were huge.
Yeah.
Steven, I have a question for you. What do you think, in your opinion, is the laziest or the worst kind of match to book? The worst type of match to book?
Could you elaborate more on that?
For instance, because I've done my fair share of booking too when I was working with some indie feds, so I was part of the booking committee, and I think the worst match at all to book is a three-way match. I feel that three-way matches are the laziest, they've never turned out well. You always got to have somebody lying on the mat outside for a good 5-10 minutes while two guys fight each other and then nearly pin the other guy, and then the guy comes in, throws another guy out of the ring, then the other two guys just sit there and they fight for another 10-15 minutes, and that guy that was out there, they just do a rotation, and it's really become one of the laziest book matches it's just, and when you can't figure out the number one contender, so you bring in three guys. I've never liked it.
Okay, I know what you mean by that. Yeah, for sure. And I do find that to be a bit of a cop-out, specifically the triple threat matches. Anytime if you can lose a title when you're not getting pinned, I think that's weak. And I personally never did that. I much preferred the three-way dance, the ECW elimination style. To me, that makes total sense, for those kind of matches. And you look back at how beautiful that, what was that huge three-way dance with ECW where it came out? It was Public Enemy, Chris Benoit, who was it? It was Benoit and Taz, Public Enemy, and Sabu was in there too. But it was this beautifully booked three-way feud, and it all built to that creation of that match. But having that elimination stipulation in there where you eliminate a team, I thought was perfect. But otherwise, because fewer matches are a bit clumsy in that sense, because it is sort of tough. You do have to take turns quite a bit, and things can get kind of funny looking like that.
Now let me turn it around and say, what is your favorite type of match to book?
Just regular matches.
No, I'm saying maybe with a specialty clause to them.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back. I like the 2 out of 3 fall matches. I like them. Cage matches were fun as well. But yeah, in general, I wasn't huge into the multiple man matches unless something built for it, or if it's a tag in and out, like a 4 corners sort of deal. Then I can get into that. But for me, the main thing was just the finish and getting some kind of a storyline going. That was like the main priority, And as long as the match made sense in the sense of the story, like for instance, I had this one. We had this one deal going. We had sort of a rivalry between these two cruiserweight types, and so the rivalry was such that we pulled in. It was sort of like a Magnum TA, Nikita Koloff deal. Remember when they pulled out that best of seven to sort of settle their thing for the U.S. title? So we sort of did a thing where it was like 2 out of 3 matches over the course of 3 cards, and then the winner of the first match gets to like pick the stipulation. And for this show, it was nice because as you'll see, as you always see in wrestling, big guys tend to like push big guys. That when the big person is in charge of the promotion or owns it or is booking it, they tend to want to push those big guys. So you got Bill Watts doing that sort of thing, and Appa was the same way. It was more believable for the people on top to be bigger people. And so it was always sort of a thing where I'd try to, push some of our lighter weight, cruiserweight guys to try to find ways to sneak them in there, where he doesn't notice, so to speak, where he doesn't realize that they're, all of a sudden in a main event. And so this little 2 out of 3 series match, I was able to get 2 of our firm cruiserweight people, and it built to a point where we could put them in the main event because we had like a cage match and that sort of stuff. And so I always like to sort of push things in that way, and try to expand and stretch out, what wrestling can be.
Now, how do you tell a storyline in this day and age of kayfabe? Is that something that you really have been responsible for? Have you been trying to build any storylines now in this sort of era where it's a lot different than back in the 80s where you could just, have the Russian against the American, or have, the farm boy against the millionaire,
Right.
How do you tell a story now that involves people?
I don't think that that's a problem, really. I think you do it as you always did. I think the problem is when you leave that window open to that fourth wall too much, which WWE tends to do, and when you get too many winks into the audience like that, I think you lose engagement. To me, I think you book everything just like you would traditionally, but what you do is you keep a very firm wall border between when the show ends and or when the show starts and when the show ends. And I believe from those opening credits to the closing credits, everything that happens in there should be treated as a pure shoot. Now, maybe afterwards you have the Bravo, watch what happens live sort of thing. If we want to go that way, I have no problem with that. Then you sort of deal with stuff there, or on Twitter, maybe, you can sort of shoot with that. But I believe that we all can still suspend our disbelief. And everyone knows Game of Thrones is a work, Walking Dead is a work.
Star Wars, they don't sit around and say, this is just special effects here.
Exactly. And it still draws. So the idea that just because, everyone knows it's fake, well, then it's not going to, not many people are going to watch. Well, these shows that I'm mentioning, they're still drawing like 20 to 25 million viewers to it. And I think wrestling can as well. But when you get that wall breaking, like I remember years ago, like Dean Ambrose was on there and there was some extra on there during some segment. And he sort of looks at him and winks at the camera. And he was like, "Hey, weren't you like a Rosebud last week?" And they're using extras for Adam Rose or whatever. It's like that sort of stuff, like these little inside, elbow jabs, to the insider Twitter crowd. It's like, yeah, you got that pop on Twitter and you got some people that snicker. But is it really building the audience? Is it making the show any better when they write those sorts of things? I'm not blaming the guy, Dean Ambrose, Moxley at all. These things are written, but it's like, I think if you have that firm wall, then you can do everything you used to do. But as long as it will allow people to suspend their disbelief, from the beginning of the show to the end, and they could definitely get into these angles, definitely get invested in all these wrestlers again. Because what's nice about that is, like, you watch the show, you enjoy it, and then it's just like having special features on a DVD. You don't have to watch those. You can either just watch the movie and go about your life, or you can watch that movie and listen to the director's commentary, or look up on the internet interviews about it. I would rather fans have that choice to, be in that fantasy world and only have that, or if they want to look outside, they can take those options. But when you start overlapping stuff and you're watching Raw and then all of a sudden the Miz is on in a commercial, talking about some charity or something, or visiting sick kids in the hospital, after we just saw an angle on TV where he's like sneak attack somebody and, it knocks him out with a chair. I don't like that overlap like that at all. I think you have the clear, distinct borders, then I think you're good all around.
I agree. WWE, I would say, has one, if not the greatest talent bases in history. I mean, they have an unbelievable roster, and I watch and I just don't care. I don't care. And part of it is, if they're not serious about it, why should I be?
Absolutely.
And it's almost an exercise in frustration. You mentioned before, Shane McMahon. I mean, 15 years into it, the guy can't throw a convincing punch. I mean, he's good at throwing himself off large objects, high objects, but, Ricky Steamboat, he isn't. So, again, I just have you mentioned emotional investment. It's just not there. And
Absolutely.
I could turn on New Japan cold and just get like totally involved in a match because it's presented as sport. It's presented as art. And speaking of art, I wanted to talk about your show. Before, let me preface it with, I don't know if you're aware, but during the 1970s, there was a brief renaissance where they would bring back, classic radio drama. In the 70s. Oh, yeah. In the 70s, I was listening to Fibber McGee and Molly, The Shadow, Arch Obler. Arch Obler was
this part
great.
My brother would love, because my brother used to, as a little kid, I was born in 67. So that 70s renaissance you're talking about was right when we were growing up. And my brother would listen to those radio dramas every night. So this part is dedicated to my brother. I want him to and he listens to the show every week. So he'll be really interested to hear about your wrestling radio drama.
So for those who are not familiar with what I was talking about, Fibber McGee was a comedy. They'd open up a closet and you'd hear 10,000 things fall to the floor. And it was just, so imaginative and so great. And, people don't realize, like my parents, they were born in the 20s and 30s. They didn't have TV. They listened to radio drama.
Yeah.
So, what Steve is doing with Kings of the Ring is amazing. And, why don't you tell us about it and what inspired you to do it?
Thanks very much.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is true. It's complete theater of the mind, so it sort of frees things up here. And so Kings of the Ring is the first, they call them audio drama podcasts now, because that's how they're listened to. You can download it just like any other podcast and on your podcast apps. So it's sort of like a genre that formed quite a few years ago, but it's mostly like a lot of true crime stuff. A lot of science fiction, mystery, horror sorts of things. And that's like the bulk of what these audio dramas are. And they're starting to get picked up for TV shows. Like there was this new Julia Roberts show called Homecoming in the last year or two. I think it was on Hulu. That was actually an audio drama show.
Wow.
And there's other ones like that. And so when I had the original idea for the story of Kings of the Ring, and in trying to find ways to make it most available to wrestling fans, because it was originally conceived as a TV show, but those, you don't get those made overnight. And I wanted this sort of out there in one form or another. And so that's when I discovered the audio drama podcast, which would have been 2018. And so I thought this lent perfectly to it, because you want it to be a step up from just a novel or a book, because as you're describing, it's that whole theater of the mind thing. And in a way, you're sort of not limited by a budget. Like if you're in a TV show or a movie, you're still limited, by how much money you can afford for these explosions and all that. But for audio drama, radio theater, your explosion is just a sound effect
Right.
in the way you would describe it. So it sort of frees it. And in Kings of the Ring, it allows me to also be in any location on the world. I can be in, islands of Puerto Rico, or the back roads in Texas, or, in the Tokyo Dome in Japan, because of the nature of that medium. And so what Kings of the Ring is it's focusing on the behind the scenes world of wrestling. And so I honed in on the 80s. So it's a fictional retelling of the 1980s wrestling wars, but then it's written and produced like a cable drama series, like you'd see on HBO or Netflix, like a Sopranos, Mad Men type show, just audio only, of course.
I love Glow. I
Oh
watch
yeah,
every episode of Glow, and I
yeah.
like this better than the actual wrestling Glow 30 years ago.
I agree. That's funny you say that. I remember watching the Glow show, and I'm like, I don't remember it being
It's probably made
being the
more
same
money
that day.
too. It's
Yeah, it
probably
probably
wound up
has.
making more money than the original
It's like, hey,
Fed did.
good for you. If we could all have a TV show in our lives 20 years later and make us look that much better, hey, more power to that. But yeah, but the idea of Kings of the Ring was sort of following like the rise and fall of the power brokers or the kings of wrestling. Sort of the rise and fall of that, while also showing that peek into the sex, drugs, and muscles lifestyle of the 80s wrestlers. And so that's sort of the premise of this world. Because I noticed, like, like if you look at guys like Eric Bischoff or Bruce Pritchard or whatever, when you really get down to it, like the last 30 years or so, it's sort of only been controlled by about 15 guys. If you kind of look, and they just sort of switch companies. You look at Bruce Pritchard right now. He was with, started in the Indies for Paul Bosch, and he was with WWF forever. But then after he got let go, he sort of vanished, and then he showed up in TNA for a couple of years, and then he vanished again, and then he comes back with these podcasts with the Conrad shows and all that, and he becomes relevant, and all of a sudden WWE brings him back, and now he's actually running. He's like number 2 to Vince right now. So I always found it interesting how it's like a regular TV show, like Dallas or Dynasty, whatever, how these people sort of pop in and out, they ride high career-wise, they can vanish for a while, and then they just come back out of nowhere. So that was sort of the idea, and that's, where the name comes from, Kings of the Ring. And so I felt the 80s was the perfect time because I consider that one of the most important eras in wrestling, because that was when we had that real switch, when we began the end of the territories into that national expansion, sort of going right along with the rise of cable TV. So with that much change, I thought this is the perfect spot to focus in on to tell this story.
Kayfabe still lived back then, and then there was still kayfabe that was alive back then.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big themes of this show, and to remind people like us, but also younger listeners who like maybe were born in the 90s and they really don't, the only world they ever knew was wrestling on the internet or whatever. But I wanted to show what the world was like in the days where kayfabe was so strong, and the lengths that the wrestlers and the people in wrestling did to protect that and to keep that wall up and to really show the differences. And I think in the frame of an entertainment show, I think it's intriguing that, that these people that live like a fantasy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and what they do from in the ring to behind the scenes to just being at a gas station, just running into some fan, and what they do to make sure that the belief in this being a shoot, being real, what was held so strongly. And that's a definite big theme of the show, and the competing philosophy therein of that, because there are others who want to move past that or don't really care as much about protecting that. So those are some of the conflicts in the show as well.
Sometimes the wives were not smartened up.
Right.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I remember, Jeff Jarrett was saying something like that. His dad didn't smart him up till he was like 13 or whatever.
Yeah.
His dad's like the booker and co-owner, but that was just the way it was across the board. It was just incredible.
Have any wrestlers or promoters come back to you and said, "This hits too close to home. This is something that is too close to me," or that they'll figure out that you're talking about me here, and I don't want you saying something like this. Or anyone?
Oh, I see.
Anyone?
Yeah, I absolutely not in the sense. Well, first of all, just the expose all around, just because of the time we're in, it's not really an issue anymore. And at my heart, I'm one who believes in kayfabe, and thinks that it should have never gone away. So I'm very old school like that. But these are one of the ways that I've reconciled over the years to just accept that's the way it is. So Kings of the Ring is like, it's a total expose. Like I would never have done a show like this, like in the '90s, when things weren't all the way open, when the lid wasn't completely ripped off. Now it's like I just stopped fighting. It's like, well, we're in a world where everyone knows. Let's just take advantage of it, and I'm going to create a show that really shows everything. Now, as for people that it's based on, no. How this works is I take all the stories, all like the anecdotes and legendary road stories in wrestling, the events that happen, the Montreal screw jobs, the Vince McMahon trying to destroy the territories, Sid Vicious and Arn Anderson getting in a scissor fight at a UK, hotel room. So I take every story we've ever heard, and I sort of gather that all together and tweak things and reassemble it in the context of one giant fiction series. So that's like the premise of it. So as a result, there's so many people involved in any era of wrestling. So it would be too spread out if I'm to just like tell like a documentary style and just dramatize everything. It's too spread out. So the idea is to sort of consolidate everything. And so the characters are fictional here, and they're more like archetypes of it. So they sort of represent a certain type of wrestler. But I purposely make sure the events and the stories are mostly based on at least a version of something that happened, or even like a tall tale, an exaggeration, or even a rumor. Like one of my favorite rumors was the one that Iron Sheik was supposedly offered $100,000 by Vern Gagne to break Hulk Hogan's leg. Now, who knows if that's true or not? But I love the idea if that was true, and I would love to see that, in an actual show. And so that's like what the Kings of the Ring is about.
He
Taking
told
these
me
crazy, outrageous things.
that face to face.
Yeah.
But the thing with the Sheik is he's told the same stories so many times. Sometimes I think he thinks it's real, and it's not always real. Some of his stories,
right?
So
sort of lose track over time.
One too many suplexes, and suddenly what was a tale becomes the truth.
Right, exactly. And so I love that sort of lore, and there's so many great stories and so many, people's noses getting bitten off and this and that. I just think it's a fascinating world that translates really well, the form of an entertainment show. For wrestling fans, it's sort of like seeing it sort of visualized more, stories you may have heard about or stories you didn't hear about. And for non-wrestling fans, it's a way to like see this crazy, wacky world of wrestling and all these shenanigans that went on that, they had no idea was happening.
Now, Buddy and I, as you can see, this is all improv, and basically, we wing it. I mean, I can't even imagine how much time and effort you must put into your episodes. How much time does it take to do one episode of Kings of the Ring?
Well, overall, it's a full-time deal, but it's sort of done more in layers. Like unfortunately, I made the mistake of making this like an ensemble cast thing, so it has to be pretty elaborate, like in a Game of Thrones sense. If I was smarter, if I redid this, maybe I'd just focus in on, one territory or like one wrestler. It'd be a lot easier. But because I'm trying to tell a bunch of stories all at once to sort of overlap things. It's one of the things I liked about Game of Thrones is how intricate the stories were, so that you'd see things in season 1 that might not have meant a lot at the time, but then the payoff comes like in season 3, and it's like, oh, okay, I remember back when that happened. So I try to put a lot of that into this show. So I do have to plot things out quite a bit in advance before I ever, start like writing an actual script. And then so everything's laid out. So I mean, generally speaking, I have things laid out, for the next 10, 20 years, all the way up to like the 2000s. Just as at least seeing an idea.
Yeah, long-term booking.
Right. So I at least know where things are going, and I have like scenes in my head when I first came up with this. But then, like, of course, in the 80s, that's where things get a little more specific. And then season by season, I'll grab it and then sort of break it down, and then I'll actually write the script month to month. That'll take like, a few days or less than a week. But it's mainly like that. So it's a lot of planning, plotting, and then we get the actual fine details of the sculpture, in the week or so.
Could I safely say that season 1 You had to invest hundreds of hours, if not thousands.
Yeah, I guess I never really counted it like that. I know it ended up being 20 episodes, which was more than I thought it was going to be, because the story's sort of there, and then the issue was breaking it down, to create a season out of that, breaking that into episodes, and I kept sort of underestimating how long this was going to be, and also trying to get things to line out timeline wise. I might have like this much story, from the All South group out of Dallas, then I might only have like this much story out of St. Louis. So then I have to, break things up and get things to sort of match up chronologically. So season one ended up being like 1984 from like January to December, and I didn't realize that until about halfway through that that's what it was going to be, all of 1984. So for example, in season one, in hindsight, I would have broke it up after about episode 11, and then that would have been season two. So I sort of look at it as two parts, but recognizing that, I've got a much better planning system now. So season two right now is going to be 10 episodes, and season three will be 10 episodes, and everything is sort of plotted out where things will be
That's kind of like the HBO, MO. They do about 10, 12 episodes, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I try to base that off of. But yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to ask, how does it feel to have something like this that's a creative thought that you've had, that you've plotted out 20 years? So I just remember for myself, one of the greatest things that I was able to do was I created, even Evan doesn't know this, but I created a pro wrestling game, a dice game in high school.
That's old school.
Yeah, well, because I was so bored in government class that I had to entertain all the other guys around me. So I had dice and charts, and I even illustrated it, and I created a character that was in that wrestling game that I wrote.
Right.
And actually, in real life, I found a way to make that guy into a real wrestler. Mr.
Right.
Massacre. I put a mask on a 7-foot guy, and I took him out to the ring, and he was a hit. And that to me is like, if I died at that moment, I would have been okay, because I would have said I made a masked wrestler that people believed in, and that was such a creative like completion for me. How does it feel for you to do these sort of things and to then see the reception of them by other people?
It's special. I love it, and I'll quickly say I did the same exact thing that you're talking about. I had a little fantasy booking type stuff when I was a kid too, but I still had some things in my back pocket, over time. So as I'm actually getting in the business, it was fun to be able to sort of like pull some stuff out, and pretend it's like a brand new idea. It's like, listen, your name's going to be Gravestone, that sort of thing. When it's actually, like my Mr. Massacre sort of deal. So I know exactly what you mean. It's sort of like an inside thing where it's like, well, I'm not going to tell anyone. You're going to be like, what? But so it's like, for me, it's like, yep, oh, this is cool. Like, I got that in there.
Well, tell me about your Gravestone character. Tell me about what he was all about.
Oh, it was just like an undead type. It was mainly the name, because I was one of the guys I was managing. He was sort of switching over to be like another, like sort of a red face painted, general demonic monster heel type. We needed a name. I'm like, okay, let's do this. It's like I sort of had a character like that when I was younger. So let's go with the Gravestone.
That is awesome.
Speaking of reception, tell us a little about your audience. I mean, the programming is about the 80s, but is the audience younger? Is the audience older? Is it a mix? What are you finding?
What I'm finding is we're probably in the U.S., probably the most fans I'm getting are, it is spread out, I should say, but I got a lot of fans in the Southeast, especially Tennessee and Texas. I used to track this more the first year on that, but it's definitely hitting home for a lot of Southern fans. But at the same time, there's like, just as many in the Northeast, in New York and that sort of thing, and spread out throughout the country. We probably have about 5 to 10% of my audience is from the UK as well, which is what I'm really happy about that, because I really want the people like in Australia or the UK, places that like when they got exposed to the American wrestling, it was like the 90s. You know, like they didn't get that sort of 80s wave. So the UK people, they got it like Davey Boy Smith. You know, Australia, they didn't get it to like the 2000s. India, they didn't get it to like 10, 15 years ago. So I like the idea of introducing this world to those folks that are like huge wrestling fans, but sort of they didn't get to grow up with Hulk Hogan, you know, and the Four Horsemen in that sense. So I like being able to bring that flavor to them.
I'll tell you something about the UK that you guys may not be familiar with. My cousin is a dean at a university over there, so I've been there many times, and they would have guys dressed as WWE characters, which is totally illegal. You know, the guy was dressed as The Rock, dressed as The Undertaker, but he'd have a British accent, you know, and the little kids believed, you know, the three.
Oh, on the actual shows?
On actual shows, yeah. You know, and they would announce him as The Undertaker or The Rock, and he'd cut a promo with a heavy British accent, you know. But they got away with it for the longest time.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah. But and back to your original question, buddy, to see this actually for real, to be, you know, take a life of its own, Kings of the Ring, and the fan following that it's developed over the last couple of years. It was like it was 2 years ago this weekend when the show first launched internationally, and it does have a really nice fan base, and I get a lot of good feedback from fans and people that are really, you know, engaged with the show and are fully into it. I've got a Patreon account, and that's been steadily growing. I mean, quite a pop the last month or so too, and I really want to keep that going. But I always appreciate the fans that follow this because it's not done before a live audience, and I don't have like TV ratings to compare it so much to. So I don't always get that instant feedback or know if something's getting over. So a lot of the show, I'm basically writing to pop myself. You know, that, like if it's sort of like Kiss. Paul Stanley would always say this. It's like, you know, Kiss was the band that I always wished I could see. You know, and that's how I feel about this show. I would love the show if I was a fan. So it's like it works for me on all levels, and if other fans love it too, then it's even better. You know, more gravy to it.
Now, I'd like to also kind of rewind a little bit when you talk about your Polynesian background. And I've always wanted to ask someone who's Polynesian about this, which is, what is the attraction between Polynesian culture and pro wrestling? Because it's certainly a great, when you talk about the small percentage that you are of the population, considering what a large percentage you are of the wrestling population, why? Yes. Can you tell me what your thoughts are?
See, and that's a great question. This is something that Afa sat me down with when he was trying to talk me into wrestling more full time, and he was bringing this up, and exactly what you're talking about there. Because if you think about it, how many job guy Polynesian wrestlers were there that you can remember? Like, think of everyone. Everyone's gotten a push, right? It's like there's no run of the mill, you know, Samoan wrestler or anything like that. Everyone always had a push to a certain degree. And what Afa was talking to me about, and these are things I sort of knew but never thought about, was our people are physical. There's a natural physicality to it. And a lot of our culture is also performance based. So a lot of our people from any of these islands grow up performing before people, and in a physical ways, like dancing and athletics as well. And there's also a natural flamboyance and charisma that a lot of us will have, and you'll see that in the wrestling. So it's always like there's always like a minimum baseline of qualification that nearly any Polynesian wrestler will have when they show up. And because guys like Peter Maivia and the Wild Samoans and everyone else did such a great job, everybody, it just cements that reputation. So that when bookers and promoters find out, you know, oh, there's a Samoan kid here or someone from Hawaii or whatever, they instantly know that they're going to be at least this good. You know, that there's always like a minimum level of ability that's going to come right along with it. And then at the same time, you know, you got people like The Rock who are going to come along where the sky is the limit. So, but
well, having had Samoa Joe dive out on me once over time, I know how tough these guys are, and that's the other side of it. Is it isn't that sort of also comes with the territory? that if you're Samoan or you're Pacific Islander, you got to be tough.
Exactly. There's a lot of physical toughness to it. Samoans, especially the ones coming from American Samoa, there's actually two Samoas. One is an independent nation that used to be connected to New Zealand, and then there's the American Samoa side. And so this all happened 100 years ago, like before World War I. They're sort of dividing things up and finding what can be a U.S. territory. So so that's where a split came. So they all used to be one people, but then they sort of got divided governmentally, and things sort of went in different directions. Now, American Samoa, what makes American Samoa distinct, where Afa and Sika grew up, and people like that, is it's not like this friendly sandy resort island. It's not like soft meadows of banana plants and everything. It's a rock, and that's a nickname. That's where the rock gets the nickname from, because it's a nickname for Samoa called a rock, because it's like one big mountain of hard land, and there's just like a road that sort of goes along the coast around it, and people sort of live within the mountains and along the shore, and it's like a hard land to live on. And so that's another reason why the football players come out so tough, because their fields are basically on these rocky, volcanic, mowed out areas. And so it sort of builds a toughness to it, in the same way that Vikings 1,000 years ago, you see the physical land in Norway and Sweden and all that, and these fjords and these harsh winters. It will breed a certain type of physical person. And that's the same thing that happens, on these islands, in American Samoa, Hawaii, everywhere.
Have you had a chance to? I'm sorry.
I want you guys to know, I saw Peter Maivia wrestle both Superstar Billy Graham and Backlund, headlining the Garden, face and heel. I saw Afa wrestle Backlund, main event in the Garden. I saw Sika wrestle Backlund, and of course, Snooker and Tonga Kid wrestling against Piper. I mean, great. So these guys were tremendous athletes and huge stars. You're headlining Madison Square Garden. I mean, it doesn't get much.
Have you had a chance to travel to back to New Zealand and back to Samoa or any of the other Pacific Islands?
What was that? Can you go there?
No, have you had a chance to travel?
Oh yeah. Well, my family's out of New Zealand, so most of my family is there. So I'll be able to get back there every 5 to 8 years or so. My wife's Samoan.
Given the COVID situation, I'd probably move back there tomorrow.
Right, just be sealed off. Yeah, it's pretty clean.
Yeah, I'd go with the quarantine, because then you're safe after that. Here in Marin, if it isn't the fires that are nearly choking us to death, we've got COVID everywhere else. So, New Zealand sounds damn good to me. Me and a bunch of sheep sounds pretty good right now.
But yeah.
We have to wrap up the show because Buddy's house is on fire.
Close to it. You look outside, it does smell like a campfire is going in my backyard.
But yeah, my wife she's Samoan. And I met her through Afa's family and all that. So wow. I go to Samoa every few years as well. So I'm closer with everyone there. So I'm pretty familiar with the place, outside of Pops and everybody. But yeah.
It's on my bucket list of a place I'd love to visit. The plane flight wasn't such an incredible ordeal.
Right.
I've been to Fiji, and that was enough. Fiji is tough enough to get out there, but going all the way out to New Zealand is quite a trek.
Yeah, it is. The planes are getting a little better every year, though, a little bit more comfortable and everything. So it makes the trip a bit easier. But if you talk to anyone that's ever been to any of these places, you'll never hear them say a bad thing about it. So definitely do it if you can.
So what is the future of, I'm thinking about, all the things you're describing, and I'm thinking in this time of COVID, what you're doing has a tremendous appeal, because you give people what they want in good booking and action and drama and intrigue, yet nobody can get COVID from any of what you're doing.
Exactly. You don't have to wear a mask when you listen.
There's a need for that kind of entertainment right now, I mean, don't you feel like COVID has really crippled what we've been watching in wrestling for the most part, and given us such a subpar product all year long, and the ratings are showing it?
Right, yeah, absolutely. All the live entertainment's going to be suffering, and you really don't know how long this is going to last for that. But it seems like live in-person entertainment is probably going to be the last thing, to get restored back to normal. So yeah, it is definitely affecting things. You can see in the AEW and WWE, you can clearly see what a difference it makes. I think AEW has held up a lot better ratings wise, but you can definitely see how the show's been affected. I think AEW, one of its best strengths is like one of its biggest weaknesses right now, and it's their live crowd interaction is so much better than WWE. And so, I mean, so much, especially someone like Orange Cassidy, so much of the strength of All Elite Wrestling is these arenas full of like these crazy enthusiastic fans that know the talent so well, and they just get into it to a ridiculous extent. And it is sort of sad when that's sort of removed from the equation like this. And then, of course, with WWE, their production's just been flat from the start. That they have not coped well with a no fan situation. Yeah, and their ratings have just continued to slide, combined with the type of show they're putting out.
If you're booking a WWE show, and let's say you were in charge of SummerSlam, what do you think you would do differently to try to make things more exciting and make people more engaged?
Well, what I would do, particularly for these pay-per-view shows, and this goes for either company, I think you want to like take advantage somehow of the situation. So it's like, yeah, we got no fans, but instead of looking at it as okay, we have an arena which is now empty, I say let's be like, okay, so we don't have fans, then we don't have fans. Let's think about where we can go. So why can't we have the Great American Bash, back in July that they did? Why can't we stick that on like the USS Intrepid in New York? Why can't we stick a ring there, with the Statue of Liberty behind you? I think they should take advantage more of the not being bound by a location, like UFC with the Fight Island. I mean, it just sounds like a cool thing, and it harkens back to like the old, Japanese death matches with Mr. Saito and everybody. But like, especially with AEW, you got all these video game marks like Kenny Omega and all that. You could totally do like a Street Fighter Mortal Kombat thing where like every single match, like one match is like at a warehouse somewhere, with some weird background. Another match is like in a city alleyway.
I like that.
Just take advantage of it more. Take your camera crew on the road, film these things over a week or two, and then it sort of adds like more visual interest for the viewer at home. Yeah, right. It's like a whole thing, and I think they could take advantage of that better. Just having something cool looking and gritty, and don't look at the lack of fans as a negative, but let's take advantage of it. Let's stick it in like like a movie set where the Terminator once fought. Let's stick a ring in there and let's have an actual combat there. It'll be kind of interesting visually, because ultimately that's what the problem is. Especially when WWE first started out, it's like you got this quiet, dark performance center with these empty rows like a movie theater before the movie starts, and then you got two guys wrestling a match whispering to each other, and it's just like,
and still trying to perform for an audience that isn't there. They're like going out and shouting to like nobody in particular.
I know. I noticed that when they first did it, it's like they forced these poor wrestlers to still be like pointing out into the stands or cutting promos while facing empty seats. It's like, listen, we already know that there's no one there. It's like, can we just let them be natural and just talk straight into the camera?
What do you think of that Thunderdome thing?
If I'm to nitpick on it, I think it's too bright. There's no contrast between the wrestlers in the ring and the wall behind them, and especially on the side shot, it loses its three-dimensionality and everything looks too flat. So I think they need to stagger the lighting out somehow to create more depth. And then the other problem is you can't run this live as we've seen, because fans are gonna, they're gonna be mooning the screen and all these other shenanigans. So that was just an oversight. I don't know why they didn't have like 5 to 10 crew members just monitoring these screens. As soon as someone's starting to do something different, just bam, just click them right off, and bring someone else's face out there. But otherwise, I'm disappointed in WWE that it took them this long, because they totally ripped off the NBA. And it bothers me that they didn't have a solution until the NBA came up with something. And at the same time, the NBA's, it looks awesome. Have you guys seen any NBA playoff games yet?
Yes.
I think it's great how they do that, mixing in some real people and spreading things out and getting sponsors and posters, and then still having those video walls. I love that.
I said from
pure wall, I don't know.
I said from day one they missed the golden opportunity with this. As a documentarian, I would have interviewed all these great young talent that they have at the Performance Center and get to know them as
Right.
human beings and hear their backstories. And
Absolutely.
my dad died when I was 8, but I wanted to be a wrestler since I was a kid, that kind of thing. And, I think human interest is always fascinating. And that's one of the things the boxing networks always do well. You care about the two fighters and who are these guys? Oh, I was living out of a car when I was a kid, and here I am, I'm fighting for the championship. And, there's an emotional investment instead of, just portraying these guys as, kind of cartoon characters in WWE.
Right.
I think they really missed the opportunity.
Absolutely. Definitely, it's a matter of taking advantage of a situation instead of just trying to pretend that everything's normal. Pay no attention to those empty seats over there. Everything's fine. That sort of deal. Yeah, that would have been great. To sort of
You
dive in there like
you have some 20-year-old woman. It's like, what made you want to be a pro wrestler instead of a nurse or a doctor or a teacher?
Yep.
There's a story there somewhere.
Absolutely, and asking them how they're dealing with COVID. Get what's her face, that girl that like tested twice or whatever. Let's learn more about that. Yeah, I agree completely. To take advantage of this better and get to know the wrestlers on a more personal level.
Even a Rocky like training video or whatever. It feels very claustrophobic the way it is now.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. I agree.
Well, I cannot believe it, but we're again at the end of an hour. I always find that it goes so quickly. I want to give you a couple minutes to be able to tell the audience about what you're doing, how they can follow Kings of the Ring, and any other projects that you have coming up.
Okay, yeah. So Kings of the Ring is available on any podcast app. So if you listen to podcasts at all, you just listen to it the same way. Just search Kings of the Ring. If you're using Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, whatever. Otherwise, if you go to the website kingsotr.com, there are direct links that you can hook up, so you can listen to it on your laptop or tablet as well. But it's a totally free show, and season 1 wrapped up a year ago. So that was 20 episodes of that. And then season 2 premieres this week. We move into 1985, and on September 1st is when it will drop worldwide. Patrons of the show, they've been able to listen to this since the 15th, but this is readily available. If you do get on with Patreon, I created like a recap of season 1. I sort of condensed the entire 20 episodes of season 1 into like 1 hour summary, sort of to the soundtrack of it. So if you don't feel like you want to listen to the whole first season again, or you just want that kind of refresher, just sign up even for like $1 Patreon access, and you'll be able to hear that summary. Otherwise, it'll all be free. Episode 1 of season 2 launches this week, and we are good to go. kingsotr.com, and Twitter is also kingsotr.
Are you ever going to cast Evan Ginzburg as a celebrity voice?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I'd love to.
Let me know.
Or if you need a hacky manager, I'm always available.
Oh, nice. Oh, that'd be perfect.
Steve, let me just ask one final question. Where would you like to take this ultimately? Would you like an HBO to pick it up like Glow, or how far would you like to see this go?
That exactly. TV show. I'm not coy about that when I promote the show or have been talking about it. The end goal is to be a TV series, and it's something I sort of work on concurrently with doing the podcast. Is also getting like the scripts available as well, and trying to get this slowly pitched into development through Hollywood. But that's going to take a very long time. So in the meantime, I can put this show out there. And so that's sort of the goal, just to get it out there, if nothing happens with the TV, but also to try to build a big fan following as possible, which will end up helping it get made into a TV show one day. But otherwise, it's built for a TV series, and it is an obstacle having an ensemble cast for an audio show like this, which I get, but it's because it's a TV series. So you make a audio game of your own, it still has everybody.
Mr. HBO, Mr. Cinemax, Mr. Lionsgate, if you're listening to this podcast, please let's get a TV show built around Kings of the Ring. Let's hopefully if they're listening, they'll give you a call.
Hey, Game of Thrones is over and done with.
We got to get something new.
Hey,
we need something
fill
new.
the void. Absolutely.
Anyway, it's been wonderful having you as a guest. Certainly love to have you in on the future when you've got new projects up to date, or you sort of maybe at the end of this next season you want to talk about it. We'd love to hear more stories, and it's really been great having you as our guest this week.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be here. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye to everyone, and we'll see everyone next week.